Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mel V, coming to you live on Conscious Consumer Network. It is great to be with you all again. And thank you for tuning in wherever in the world you may be. Tonight, as always, is the scheduled 7 p.m. GMT show that goes out on Conscious Consumer Network, being Stop South African Genocide. And of course, I want to welcome to the show my wonderful co-host, Karin Smith. Hello, Karin.
Hi, everybody.
And of course, we're joined today by Ken Daly. Say hi, Ken.
Good afternoon. By the way, I got to tell you, my real name is not Ken Daly. It's Ken Given. Common mistake. I've got a website, Daily Ken, so when I was on the radio, I used Ken Daly, kind of like a marketing name. But you can call me that if you want to. It's fine. Easier to remember.
You answer to almost anything, Ken.
Yes, I do. By the way, I'm not ignoring you when I look away from the camera. I'm just doing some producing in the background here, but I'm listening to everything you say.
Good. So Ken, you and I have been friends for a very long time. We have not actually met in person, but we've been friends a long time. You've been a great supporter of the white South African cause and are very, very vocal about not being a racist, not choosing any race over any other, but just drawing attention to the disparities in behavior between the races. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that's correct.
And so we in South Africa had a terrible weekend this past weekend. I have cried until I have no more tears. I'm a wrung-out rag at this stage. There were 7 farm murders this weekend. 2 70-year-old people who were forced to swallow boiling water and boiling oil. They were burnt. Another farmer was burnt with a hot iron. The things that they have done to these people, it's too terrible. And the pace seems to be picking up. So as the pace against the anti-white pace in America speeds up, it seems to be mirroring South Africa to a certain degree. And that is why I feel that Americans and Europeans should be keeping a close eye on events in South Africa, because they are happening in your country now, but at a much faster pace than they happened in South Africa.
Yeah, that's so very true. What I like to tell people is that we need to pay close attention to South Africa, because that is the harbinger of what we can expect in the United States. One of the things, guys, that, by the way, can I call you guys? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Do you say that in South? Say what?
I promise we won't call you sexist.
Okay, cool.
You call people, guys in South Africa. Hey, Karin.
Yes, we do all the time. So you're not a sexist. It's okay.
Oh, cool. Well,
you're an honorary South African.
Yeah, in the UK, they say mates, and in Australia, they say mate. So I don't know what they say in South Africa, so I think guys would work. But
Bookie.
Yeah.
Do what? Okay, that's a new one to me. I haven't heard that one before.
Oh,
but well, what's happening in South Africa is a harbinger for what we can expect to happen in the United States. I shouldn't say what we should expect to happen. I should say what we actually are seeing happening in the United States. Because, as Karin, you just mentioned, it's already occurring. Now, if you express any frustration or disappointment or opposition to the displacement of Western peoples, that is white people, then you are immediately stigmatized and demonized as a racist, which is totally insane. But the reason they do that is because it works. And also because they're racist and they hate us. When I say they, I'm talking about cultural Marxism and that whole genre of the far left. they really do hate us and they want us destroyed. I could go in that a little more in detail later why that is. But what we're seeing happening in South Africa, what was it, 1994 when apartheid fell?
Yeah.
Okay, what we have seen happening in South Africa is a regression to the norm in Africa. So if you go back to sub-Saharan Africa before Europeans showed up, what you had is a culture that was effectively, what would you call it? I hate to say caveman because it wasn't caves, but anywho, they just did not have virtually anything. They lived in dire poverty. They had no real medication of any kind, no health care of any kind. And then white people showed up. Well, according to the cultural Paleolithic is the word I was trying to think of a second ago, not caveman. Well, when white people showed up, the official story is they moved into South Africa and all of sub-Saharan Africa. They exploited the people. They took their land. They took their stuff, which is exact backwards of what happened. When Western people showed up in Africa, they enhanced the lives of virtually everybody. I mean, where can you go in Africa? Anywhere. Well, people don't have cell phones. Well, they don't have electricity, even though in South Africa it's off half the time. Where can you go where they don't have modern transportation, healthcare? All of that are life enhancements given to those people by the presence of Europeans, the expansion of Western culture. But we are convinced by the cultural Marxists who dominate the media, the educational systems, we are absolutely positively convinced that we somehow exploited those people, which is, again, the exact opposite of what really happened. And they're playing that same race card now in the United States. And we predicted this. We predicted it. We said, look, if they take down the Confederate flag, if they demonize the Confederate flag, next thing they're going to demonize the American flag. And they say, well, the Confederate flag stands for racism. Well, it didn't 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And if these people truly were concerned about racism and slavery and the abuse of humanity in general, instead of taking down monuments, they would be taking down mosques. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but, and by the way, interrupt me because I'll ramble on forever, but if you go back to 9/11, 2001, since then there have been over 31,000 documented deadly terrorist attacks committed by Islam. And, you know, there's no other ideology or group or hate group that has come anywhere near doing that. But the media ignores that. And we actually are encouraged to embrace this terrorist culture into our society while we are demonizing white people because of slavery back in the 19th century. Okay, I'm going to stop rambling because I won't stop if you guys don't stop me.
Well, you know, Ken, one of my questions is, how many slaves were actually imported into America and how many white people actually, what percentage of the white people actually own slaves? Because today in America, it's as if every single white person is responsible for that. Now, I would like to know how many of the black people in America can trace their ancestry back to slaves, and how many white people actually can trace them back to owning slaves, because it's a very small percentage today. And yet they are demanding that reparations be paid by all white people to all black people for slavery. It's a ridiculous statement to make.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. What is even more ridiculous about it, Karin, is this. What do you do with people like me that have both European and sub-Saharan African ancestry? Do I owe myself reparations because my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was an African slave? And how am I gonna pay myself? You know, how does that work? That's just stupid. I mean, it's just plain stupid. There was an article published back in 2010. Now, my memory is fading, so I'm going to have to work on this, but it was published by Henry Louis Gates. It was published, I think, in the Washington Times. Let me let me see if I can find that. I'm going to Google that real quick and see if I can find it. Typing in Henry Louis Gates, something about the blame game, I think he called it. And what he did is he pointed out, okay, here it is, the New York Times. I just found it. I don't know if your producer is able to pull that up or not on the web screen, but I've got it on my end. This is Ending the Slavery Blame Game. This is by Henry Louis Gates, who, by the way, is the premier black historian. Most people know who he is. But I want to read just a sentence of this. It says, thanks to an unlikely confluence of history and genetics, the fact that he is African-American and President Barack Obama has a unique opportunity to reshape the debate over one of the most contentious issues of America's racial legacy, reparations, which is what you were talking about. The idea that descendants of American slaves should receive compensation for their ancestors' unpaid labor and bondage. Then it goes on to say how absolutely positively stupid it is. And here's the reason. The people who were brought to the United States from sub-Saharan Africa were slaves before they came to not just North America, but all of the Americas. And you ask how many slaves came to the Americas, I don't remember, but I think it was like 400-some thousand that were brought to what is now the United States or North America. But he goes on in this article and he explains that white people didn't go to Africa and raid villages and throw nets over people. You know, the roots narrative, that nonsense. What they did is they went to the coast of Africa and they purchased slaves that were already in slavery. Now, this is what causes me trouble. And again, interrupt me if I start rambling, but this is where people yell at me all the time. We had a young black student from Harvard University that came on my stream a couple times, and he just flat out screamed at me for talking about this. But effectively, the sub-Saharan Africans who were brought to the United States as slaves, and this is what really gets me in trouble, is that was akin to winning the lottery, because many of those slaves, once you were taken captive by Africans in Africa, your life had zero value. None. In fact, cannibalism was very normal in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you were taken into slavery, there's a good chance that you weren't going to survive, because they literally held those people like cattle. They ate those people. It's horrific to think about it. But the reason we bring that up is nobody's talking about it except people like Henry Louis Gates. He's an honest historian. He'll tell you the truth. So when we brought these people, I say we, I didn't, but when those people were brought to the United States, it was like winning the lottery, because once they got here, they were given shelter, wood frame homes most of the time, sometimes log cabins. And by the way, nobody in the United States, except for a privileged few, lived in really nice houses. Everybody lived in wood frame homes. You know, Abraham Lincoln lived in a log cabin, one-room log cabin. They were given food and shelter. They were given health care. They were taken care of. Extremely different from what they experienced in sub-Saharan Africa. So does that answer your question, Karin?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there again, there's the similarity between the slavery in the United States and the poor suppressed blacks under apartheid in South Africa. They were given homes. They were given a homeland. They were allowed to be ruled by their own kings, chiefs, whatever. They were built hospitals. They were built schools. They were built churches. They were built airports. They were built roads. They were given sanitation. The biggest hospital in Southern Africa was built specifically on the edges of Soweto. If everybody knows what Soweto is, it's a black area on the outskirts of Johannesburg, where Nelson Mandela lived for a while. But the biggest and most incredible teaching hospital in Africa was built for them. And yet they demand today that we give back everything to them, the land, because when we arrived there, we arrived to this wonderful developed country with, 15-story buildings and airplanes and whatever. And because I've seen that online, that actually we are lying. When we got to Africa, we stole the cities, we stole the cars, we stole their science, we stole. It's just absolutely unbelievable to me. But the problem, as you said, is that the leftist media, etc., controls everything, including the schools. So if you are some poor innocent child and you get this rammed into your head at school and have to write exams on it, how do you know any better than that is what happens? And it scares the hell out of me, Ken, that worldwide our children are being indoctrinated into a version of history that never happened.
Yeah, it never happened. And what amazes me is that people actually believe this. But that's the way the human mind is configured. Whatever we see is what we believe. Now, there's a principle that we need to keep in mind. Is we say that we if we see it, we believe it, but many times the actual opposite is true. It's not that we believe what we see, but we see what we believe.
Yeah.
Now, if we believe that white people are racist, that's what we're going to see. We'll see white racism everywhere. Well, the truth of the matter is, you know, there was a white guy by the name of Edward Jenner, I had to stop and think of his name, who invented the vaccine that ended the smallpox virus. It's a white guy. Now, we hear about these racist white people. There was some British soldier back in 17 whatever that allegedly he claimed that he circulated blankets to Indians that were tainted with the smallpox virus. He actually said he did that. Now, whether he actually did it or not, I seriously doubt it, because he made the claim while he was in a fort that was under siege by Indians who already had the smallpox virus. And plus, the smallpox virus is largely circulated through the air, not through blankets, even though it can be. So the guy was probably making a claim that was not true. But along comes Edward Jenner, and he discovers the vaccine for the smallpox virus and saves the lives of who knows how many millions of people, probably hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Indians. And nobody talks about him. So we are seeing what we believe, and what we believe are racist. And here's what the cultural Marxists do, the leftists. They convince not only us, but everybody, the white people are racist. And so what they do is they psychologically dress us up in Klan robes and Nazi uniforms. So when you see a white person, you think racist, just automatically. I mean, you just automatically think that. It's because we see what we believe. And, you know, people need to be told the truth. Okay, let me get off base here just for a second. But there was a website you may have heard of called Daily Stormer. You remember that?
Yes.
You heard that, Stormer. I didn't like the site because I thought this guy went way overboard.
Yeah.
In fact, just flat out disagreed with him. Okay, so they took away his domain. GoDaddy said, we're not going to be your registrar anymore. So no problem. He goes finds another registrar. They do the same thing. So his website is gone. So I'm thinking, okay, well, why doesn't he just register a different name? Which he did. He registered dailystormer.lol. And the same thing, nobody would register it for him. So I thought it would be fun to see if I could do it. So I went online and tried to register dailystormer.news, and they wouldn't let me register it. Nobody on the planet can register Daily Stormer. Okay, and nobody cares because this guy was perceived as being so far to the extreme that everybody thought he was repulsive. But you know what the problem is? They have now set the precedent to go after people like me and you. All they have to do is convince themselves and everybody else these people are racist. There's no argument involved. There's no debate over the issues. All you got to do is stigmatize somebody as racist, and boom, there goes your website.
And you can't defend yourself against it, Ken, because my website, radiofreesouthafrica.com, I had 135,000 individual visits per month. Then Google asked me to please take down an article I'd posted on Nelson Mandela because they said the photographs were too violent. Well, I refused to take it down because the photographs were of the Church Street bombing, and people need to see what their hero, St. Nelson, was capable of and responsible for. So I refused to take it down. Now I have 15 visitors a month by their count. I know there are more than that because I know more than that people have visited my site. I know them personally. But by their count, that is how many people I have a month. So because I refused to do what they told me to do, I dropped from 135 to 15 in 1 month. I mean, it's totally impossible. But I believe they kind of put you at the bottom of their search engine, et cetera, so that you don't come up and you can't have visitors. The same thing happened with my YouTube channel. So yes, they indoctrinate you to believe that people like you and I are the absolute lower than the lowest, and they shouldn't listen to us. And unfortunately, people believe it. And knowing us or not knowing us, having listened to us or not listened to us, doesn't make any difference. They see what they believe and they believe what they see. You're absolutely correct about that.
Yeah, by the way, Mel, you're not saying anything.
I'm listening in very intently.
We don't want to leave you out of the conversation.
Very, very polite. Thanks, Ken.
Sure.
My contribution on this, for those of you who have been following my work, StopSouthAfricanGenocide.org. I'm a South African who is a refugee and who has fled South Africa for economic circumstances. And I'm constantly asking the question as to why, what it was that we deserved to feel that we couldn't have a living in our home countries. We had to abandon our families. So it's interesting to hear the American perspective, Ken, and I hear you talking about it from that point of view. And it actually triggered a light because there seems to be a lot of agents provocateurs going on out there who are perhaps promoting and really pushing into the public consciousness things such as the Canadian genocide of the native children in the Indian residential schools that were run by the church. Now, although it is terrible what happened to those kids, and the statistics do speak out for what happened in those residential schools, which was appalling. The thing is, I also believe that, as you rightly pointed out, these matters are now being used to generate a kind of wave of hatred against the white people, because one of the people who actually fronted that cause, a guy by the name of Kevin Annett, has regularly pointed fingers at me in his article, calling me a white South African because I called him out on certain things. It's almost as if their agenda is to turn people against you based upon the fact that you're Caucasian. So it's interesting to hear you say, bring up the whole context of the blankets, because that was one of the things that was apparently done to those kids in those Indian residential schools in Canada. They were given those smallpox-covered blankets, and
no evidence whatsoever. But that's the rumor.
Yeah, that's the story, and I'm wondering now, because it's so funny. I was so appalled when I heard this story that I actually invited Mr. Annett over to Holland twice. He stayed in my home, and after working with him, I realized that there's something wrong with this guy. He's play and there's something else working. When we actually finally called him out, the attack on me was based upon the fact that I'm a white South African. So that, and now it's all making sense. So pardon me for being quiet. I'm having a penny drop moment here and realizing we've always wondered, really, what is Mr. Annett playing at? And now it's very obvious. He's clearly part of the agenda, which is to get this whole white hatred thing going, which for a long time, I actually, even though I know that people in my home country are being genocidally murdered, the Boers, it's been a very difficult thing for me to accept, because I've never wanted to get on the, black-white sort of polarizing bandwagon. I grew up in the tolerant era of South Africa, the very brief time that it was, when white people and black people were thinking that we're going to have a rainbow nation at the end of apartheid. And it was a wonderful time to be living in South Africa because we're also filled with hope. But, that is where I've come out of. It's where my essence is. And I don't see people as black or white. I just see them as people. Just as I don't look at discriminate between man or woman or Muslim or Jew, I just see people as people. And, everything else is auxiliary. I'm not overly attached to the external locus of identity. For me, what determines character is your spirit and your intent and your heart. So this whole polarizing thing was something I pushed very hard against. But I have to say, the more information comes forward, the more I'm beginning to realize that they are trying to take it. And the question we have to ask ourselves, and everyone keeps saying, why? What happens when you get rid of the white people? So I'm interested to hear your perspective on this, Ken.
The question is, what happens when white people are gone? In my opinion, there will be a regression to the norm. Now, you got to keep in mind that somebody did a study one time, and I cannot document this. I heard about it, so I assume it's true. But somebody said that after they did some research, that for a population to be controlled by the government, the average IQ has to be 90 or below. This is what I call cultural, what would you call it? Not assimilation, but, well, let me put it in these terms. If you take a cup of coffee and you put an ice cube in it, what happens to the ice cube? It gets warm, and what happens to the coffee? It gets cool. It changes. So the coffee is not as hot as it was. The ice cube is not as cold as it was. That's what they're doing to our cultures. They take the United States and they bring in millions of people who have IQs ranging from 70 to 85. Well, what happens is the overall average population diminishes significantly. And we become a population that can be controlled. By the way, I don't know if you know this or not, but statistically, I think it was 86% of Muslims in America voted for Hillary Clinton. Surprise? So why do they want these people coming in the country? Because they're going to vote for Democrats. And why is it that in South Africa they want hordes to invade their country from sub-Saharan Africa to be around these horrific white people? Well, they're taking over the country. They're just easier to control. It's just that simple because they tend to vote for the far left. So what's going to happen once white people are gone? This is real simple. Take a look at Haiti. Take a look at any nation in sub-Saharan Africa. Or if you want to do this, go back in time to, I don't know, to the time of David Livingstone. And what he found were people living in abject poverty. That's the direction we're going. So in my mind, there is an effort afoot to destroy Western culture, Western civilization. Let me tell you why I think that is. I believe it's because cultural Marxists, which are also economic Marxists, by the way, have this insane notion that everybody should have an equal amount of wealth. Anyone who knows even the most rudimentary basic fundamentals of Marxism understands that. They want everyone to be equal. Except, of course, for the Marxists themselves, you know, the Kim Jong-un, I call him Kim Onion. They're the exception. Fidel Castro, he's the exception. Okay, but everybody has to be equal. Well, there's a problem with that from the Marxist perspective, and that is Western nations are extremely prosperous, where third world nations obviously are not. That's why we say they're first, second, third world nations. Well, how do you make everybody equal? Well, you just can't do it. What you have to do is you have to merge population groups together, and that will make us all equal. I think that's what they're trying to do. So you have this huge disparity, economic disparity between first world nations and third world nations. The way to erase that disparity from the Marxist perspective is to merge the nations, the people groups, not the nations per se, the countries, but the people groups. And what happens is everybody's equal. So the economies of Western Europe, South Africa, North America, including Canada, Australia, wherever there is a Western nation, their economies will flounder. And good news from the Marxist perspectives were economically, there is no longer any disparity. I honestly think that's their objective. They don't care about Western culture. They don't care about white people. Well, guess what? They don't care about brown people either. What they care about is this economic disparity, which they think is anathema. So they are out to destroy it. Now, having said that, let me say this, and this is something else that they will call me a racist for saying it, even though I'm the most anti-racist person on earth. If you were to take a bunch of white people and you just plop them down anywhere on the planet, with very few exceptions, they will create wealth. We've seen that over and over again. You take a bunch of people, white people, plop them down on some islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Falkland Islands. What do? They create wealth. A lot of people don't understand this, don't know this, but the Falkland Islands reportedly have the highest cost of living in South America, but they also have the highest standard of living in South America. It is because white people create wealth. Now, the same thing is true if you were to take a look at the southern 3 states of Brazil, which are dominated by white people. They're phenomenally prosperous, and they basically underwrite the rest of the economy of Brazil. Wherever white people go, they create wealth. That's just a fact. Iceland, same thing. Greenland, not very many people live there, but same thing. Wherever you go, wherever white people go, they create wealth. South Africa is a quintessential example of that. Australia, quintessential example. They moved in, they created wealth. Wherever they go, they create wealth. That's just an observable matter of fact, and it drives Marxists crazy. They can't have us being wealthier than everybody else. They don't care that our wealth and our innovation enhances the lives of all people everywhere, including their longevity. In fact, the mortality rates. In fact, they think that's a bad thing. You're familiar with the Georgia Guidestones?
Yes.
Well, you know then that on the Georgia Guidestones, it's literally etched in stone that their objective is to have a world population that's capped at, I think it's 500 million people. Well, right now there's 7,500 million people, or 7.5 billion people. That means 7 billion of us have to go. I honestly believe it drives these Marxists crazy, these globalists crazy, that white people are keeping so many people alive because they see it as not being in harmony with nature. So we had this Ebola virus, remember, in Africa a couple of years ago, and it was Western technology that saved the lives of millions of people, just like the smallpox thing. And we see that over and over again. White people are not only enhancing the lives of everybody, but we're keeping everybody alive. And the globalists don't like that. They want a small population, 500 million people at the most, that are not highly intelligent, and that is a population that they can grow. So think in terms of cultural thermodynamics. That is the ice cube in the coffee. That's thermodynamics. The temperatures will meet in the middle. That is what they're trying to achieve. I believe they want to mesh our cultures so that we can be controllable, so that we will all be the same. And I'll just wind up with this. I know I'm rambling on here. But there is this silly notion. I had a friend that posted this on Facebook a week or so ago. He said, there's only one race, the human race. That's just a lie. I mean, it's just a flat out lie. There are many races on this planet, and you're not a racist to acknowledge reality. You know, I went to a majority black high school. I could tell who the black kids were by looking at them. Literally as plain as the nose on your face. But what the globalists want is this. They want us to believe there is one people, there is one global people, one global government, one global economy, one global religious structure, one global church, one global leader. That's what globalists want. They want the globe to be one big nation. So they tell us, well, there's just one race, the human race. Well, the human race is the human race. I mean, we're all cousins. There's no doubt about that. So it's like it's half true. There is one race, the human race, but it's not the only race. I mean, it's just all of us collectively. And now they want us to believe that there's one gender. Now, I'm thinking to myself a few years ago, they're never going to pull this one off. Now, they can convince us that that race is a social, what do they call it, social construct? Which it obviously isn't, but they'll convince us of that. But there's no way they're going to convince us that there's no distinction between an XY chromosome and an XX chromosome. That is so obvious. There's no way. But guess what? They're doing it. They're convincing us that gender is just a state of mind. You can be whatever you want, or you can be somewhere in between. There's only one gender. There's only one race. There's only one economy. There's only one religion. There's only one government. There's only one world leader ultimately, and that's very dangerous. So here's my perspective on that. While it is important to defend the white race, I think it's also important to make sure that other racial groups retain their identity as well. So do you guys want to interject something? Because I could go on for an hour about this.
That's why we got you here, Ken, because we want to hear your point of view. And I'm always fascinated by your perspective on things. So you just carry on.
You want me to keep rambling?
Yeah, I'm very happy for you to ramble.
Okay, I've got in my hand this book. I'm going to hold it up so I think you can see it on the screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, this is a book authored by Robert J. Lifton. It's called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Now, the reason this book is important is it was published, I think, in 1961, and Robert J. Lifton, who I think is still alive in his 90s, psychologist, and back in the 1950s, he went to China. Actually, I think he went to Taiwan for the express purpose of studying how the communists successfully brainwashed people. He wanted to know what they were doing to these people that convinced them to believe in abject stupidity. Well, he didn't say that. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he wanted to know how that was conceivably possible. And some of these people were extraordinarily intelligent, but yet the communists were able to persuade them. Here's what they did. They would take these people and they would throw them in jail, put them in prison. And they would put chains on them, make life physically and emotionally extremely uncomfortable. And they would say, you need to confess to whatever crimes you were, somehow you were collaborating with the Western imperialists, you need to confess to that. And their first reaction was to refuse. Didn't do it. So they would make their life a little more uncomfortable. But if you just confess, we'll take your chains off. So they'd confess. You know, they're lying, they know it, but we need to get rid of these chains. Then guess what? They'll say, we don't think you're telling us everything. So they put the chains back on them. They would make life very uncomfortable. Sometimes they wouldn't let them use the restroom. They wouldn't let them sleep. They'd keep them up all night. They would put them in cells with maybe a dozen or so others who would constantly berate them for being, again, committing crimes against the people. And they would put them in this situation until they would confess a little bit more. And they would start making stuff up. Well, over a process of about 3 years of this torture and confession and torture and confession, what the Chinese communists discovered was, if you can force somebody to keep confessing, eventually they will start to believe their own confessions. And after about a 3-year period, these people actually began believing that they were cooperating with, and they didn't even know it, but now they realize it. They didn't see it before, but now they see the light. They were actually cooperating with the Western imperialist, and that is a brainwashing technique. So Robert Lifton, in his book, made a statement, something very similar to this. And by the way, if you can Google it on YouTube, you can actually hear him talking about this. He said the most dangerous thing you can do is, when it comes to brainwashing, and again I'm paraphrasing, is to get somebody to confess. Because ultimately they will begin to believe their confessions. That is the key component to brainwashing. Okay, what's that have to do with anything? How many times have you been told that you need to, they don't say confess, but they will say something like, you need to name your white privilege. That's a brainwashing technique. They're trying to get us to confess over and over again that we are racist, that we have privilege. Well, first we say that's silly. But if you hear it over and over again, and if you're put in a position where you have to confess it and name your white privilege, eventually you will start to believe your confession. So we need to be very careful protecting our brains, our minds, what we agree to. So if you were to take his book, let me see if I can find it here. In fact, you ought to buy this book. It's called Thought Reform. And actually, it's kind of boring if you read the whole thing because it's case histories. Until you get to chapter 22, which is called Ideological Totalism. So if you buy the book, just read chapter 22, unless you're particularly interested in all the case studies. And in chapter 22, he gives the 8 components of effective brainwashing. Thought reform, he calls it. And if you look at these 8 components of effective mind control, thought reform, brainwashing, you will find that is exactly what the cultural Marxists through the media and the educational systems are doing to our societies. In fact, I'm going to take a look at this real very quickly. I'm not going to read the book to you. Obviously, I'd bore you to death. But number one is what he calls milieu control. Milieu meaning social environment. So if you can control a person's social environment, that is the first component to mind control. That's why cultural Marxists want our kids in government schools beginning in preschool. They want them out of the home, out of the family, and parents are saying, yeah, we get free babysitting. They want them in an environment that they can control as long as they possibly can. Number two is what he calls mystical manipulation. He says the inevitable next step after milieu control is extensive personal manipulation. This manipulation assumes no holds barred character and uses every possible device in the milieu's command, no matter how bizarre or painful. Initiated from above, it seeks to provoke specific patterns of behavior and emotion in such a way that these will appear to have arisen spontaneously from within the environment. The element rather of planned spontaneity, directed as it is by an ostensibly omniscient group, must assume for manipulated a near mystical quality. And what we see happening is that, mystical manipulation is we see racism everywhere. I don't watch television, but I had to tie my shoe. So I sat down in the living room. My wife had the TV on. And we were watching Perry Mason. Do you know Perry Mason in South Africa?
Yes, you do.
Okay, Perry Mason was on. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Black and white show. Everybody is white. The actors are all white. Okay. Then that show went off and on came Matlock. Remember Matlock?
Yes.
Same type story. Here's a lawyer, courtroom all the time, just like Perry Mason, only it's the sheriff, whatever his name was, Taylor, Andy Griffith. Well, in that program, you would notice that the cast was mostly white, but there were one or two black people. There was one black character. Okay, in between, there were commercials. But I was watching these commercials, I think there were 3 or 4 of them, and every single commercial, they featured multiracial families.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe in freedom of association. You marry whoever you want to. It's none of my business, none of the government's business. But being fostered upon us, so we went from an all-white culture, what I would call the Perry Mason culture. Then we went to the Matlock culture. And now we have the commercial culture or the multiracial family. You know, one commercial had 2 older white people, obviously grandparents, and they were playing with their little granddaughter who was part black. They are getting inside our heads. That is mystical manipulation. It just, as he said, it just emerges, it appears to emerge spontaneously from culture. Okay, number 3 is this, demand for purity. There is absolutely, positively no toleration whatsoever. We cannot tolerate the Confederate flag. We cannot tolerate Confederate monuments. We cannot tolerate monuments to Jefferson and George Washington. We can't tolerate the American flag. Eventually, they're moving in that direction very rapidly. We cannot tolerate anything that disagrees with us from the Marxist perspective. That's why Daily Stormer came down. Now, I don't like Daily Stormer. I've read it. I said, oh, geez, what is wrong with this guy? Mm-hmm. But that's just a pretext. They are just setting us up, and other websites we know are going to come down because these people are extremely intolerant. So that is point number 3, was a demand for purity. You have to be a pure, good Marxist. And one of the components of this is what he called, well, let me just read another sentence. Don't mean to bore you to death. He says, at the level of the relationship between individual and environment, the demand for purity creates that we may term a guilty milieu and a shaming milieu. That's what cultural Marxists do. They shame us. They make us feel guilty about being white. They shame us into, we're forever explaining that I'm not a racist. We have to make, they use this intimidation factor, and it works. It's a brainwashing technique. If you don't agree with them, they will shame you. They don't use logic. I mean, if liberals were logical, they would not be liberals. They'd be conservatives. So logic has nothing to do with it, but they use other techniques like shaming us into agreeing with them. If you don't believe this, then there's something wrong with you. You're racist. You're an evil person. You're a bad person. And so, well, I don't want to be a bad person. And they use social rejection. If I was sitting in a Dairy Queen a few years ago with a friend. I may have mentioned this to you before, Karin, and we were talking about history and about the fact that there were thousands of free black people who owned black slave labor in the United States. The first legal slaveholder in the United States, Anthony Johnson, was black. The largest slaveholder in South Carolina, 1860, at the onset of the Civil War, was black. There were a large number of black soldiers who bore arms during the Civil War for the Confederacy. The first military officers, black military officers in American history, served the Confederacy. The last Confederate general to surrender, field general to surrender, was a Cherokee Indian. He was the chief of the Cherokee Nation that voted to support the Confederacy. There were 7 Indian tribes that fought for the Confederacy. So we were discussing these things. And there was a woman with, I'm guessing, her 2 or 3 grandsons sitting at the table next to us. And she got mad and got her kids, and she stormed off and went and sat somewhere else because she didn't want to expose their minds to this racism. Well, it's truth. Reality in their minds is racism. So what they do is they shame us into silence. You can't talk about history, real history, because if you do, well, you're a bad person. You're obviously a racist. So what do? We just quit talking about it. Okay, and then the next point is cult of confession. We already talked about that. And by the way, he's applying this to dangerous religious cults as well, that if you want to convince somebody of anything, get them to confess over and over and over again, and they will come to believe their own confessions. Then the next point is what he calls the sacred science. I lost track of what point I'm on here, but there's 8 of them. Sacred science is you believe a science that is not true, as if it were true, because it's sacred. You just have to believe it. And this is kind of like the global warming thing. You don't need any science to back it up, but it's scientific because, well, it just has to be because you believe it. I mean, that sounds very weird, but that's, why is it that there are, 1 million Hindus that believe they're related to cows? Sacred science. I mean, it's not real science, but, they'll go to extremes to prove that we're related to the cow. That's just part of human nature, and cultural Marxists exploit that component of our psychology. So the sacred science is that white people are somehow genetically evil. And they will even tell you, they've done studies with newborn babies, and they can detect in the reaction of newborn babies when they show them photographs of black kids or white kids that the little white babies will make a face. So, that's fake science. It's baloney. That's nonsense. But they will say, see there, we have science that white people are innately racist. You're just born racist. There's nothing you can do about it. The next one, and I love this one, is called loading of the language. What they do is they interject terminology into our lexicon that reinforces their perspective. And you could probably just off the top of your head think of a million of these things. Probably the first one is the word racism itself. If you were to go back 100 years, say 1917, and talk to just about anybody and ask them about racism, so you go back to New York City, 1917, stop somebody on the street and ask them, what do you think about racism in America today? Well, the term had not yet entered our lexicon, so they wouldn't know what you're talking about. So that is one of many that they have interjected into our lexicon. White guilt is another one. White privilege, that's part of their lexicon. That's a part of their language loading. They interject these terms and terminologies into our language. Well, homophobia is one. Islamophobia is another one. all these words that end with phobia. Those are language loading terms, and we just accept them. And because we're using those terms, and we obviously must believe what they say. The next one is this: doctrine over person. That is to say, the ideology is more important than the individual themselves. So you may wonder, how is it conceivably possible? This just drives me crazy. Feminists, I call them pseudo-feminists. They are so outraged that women are abused and mistreated, as well they should be, except for Muslims. Then it's perfectly okay. That doesn't make sense. How is that conceivably possible? It is because the doctrine is to destroy Western culture, Western civilization. The doctrine is not to advocate women's rights. That's just an excuse, a pretext for destroying the traditional Western family. So they say, at one time, they say, we are advocates of women's rights unless you're Muslim, and then we embrace you. Totally nonsensical, contradictory. The next point is the dispensing of existence, and he says this: the totalist environment draws a sharp line between those whose right to existence can be recognized and those who possess no such right. In the cultural Marxist perspective, there are some people like Daily Stormer who have no right to exist. Say, well, isn't freedom of speech designed to protect those who say stupid things that are just really bizarre? Isn't that the whole idea? Well, actually it is, but not from the Marxist perspective. Cultural Marxists think there is an ideology that has no right to exist. Now, here's the scary part. During the counter demonstration in Baltimore, they had the freedom of speech rally. And you have thousands of people objected to the freedom of speech. Are you kidding me? No. But you would see signs that were being held by some of those counter demonstrators that said something like this: stop pretending your racism is patriotism. So they were equating patriotism with racism. If you're a patriot, you're obviously a racist. And so they have zero tolerance for patriots. If you love America, if you are grateful for the founders of this country, what they did, if you are grateful for the fact that Western innovation has enhanced the lives of everybody, you're a racist and you have no right to exist. That's what Dr. Lifton calls the dispensing of existence. So you just don't have any right to exist. Those are the 8 points. Anywho, I would encourage everybody to get this book. And if you think it's boring, just go right to chapter 22, and you don't have to read the rest of it. He lays it out. Now, by the way, I've heard this guy on YouTube, and he's not a conservative by any means. He makes fun of Ronald Reagan. He's a liberal, but he's honest. When it comes to brainwashing, or he calls it thought reform. And you don't have to do that. You can just go right to YouTube and type in Robert J. Lifton, and his lecture's like a half hour, I think. And you can actually listen to him as he goes through these 8 points, components of brainwashing, thought reform, and explains it.
So we get a kid at preschool age, and we start brainwashing them at that age until they are unable to distinguish reality from what is not real. So then there is really no hope for civilization and any grasp on history, where we came from, nothing. That is a very, very sad viewpoint of the world, though, Ken. I mean, I don't want to live in a world like that.
Well, unfortunately, that's the way we're going. And, I'm well into my 60s.
Yeah.
And I have had the privilege of living in the United States of America during its apex, 1950s, 1960s. And by the way, we are right now at the apex of human civilization in terms of technology. But, I was tremendously privileged, not white privileged, but privileged to have lived in this place at that point in time. I didn't know it, but I was living at the very height of human civilization. I don't want to live in that world, but I'm not going to have to because, statistically, I'm going to be dead at age 78.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, let me say this. The year was 1973, and I went with a college group to visit London, England. It was, the idea was to study the life of John Wesley. And so we went to London and we visited all the sites that pertain to John Wesley and a lot of other sites. During the, 1 week or so that we were in London and surrounding areas, I can recall seeing a black guy who was selling ice cream outside a museum. Bought ice cream from him, by the way. But the whole time we were there, that is the only person I saw in England who was not white. Now, I know at that time there were, a lot of black people living in England, but we didn't see them. Everybody was white. That was, help me with the math, 73, how many years ago was that? 43 years ago?
43 years, yeah.
Geez, man, am I that old? That's amazing. But in those, 40 some years, our culture has been inverted. We're being destroyed. It's being overrun. And we're basically incapable of stopping it. So I agree. I don't want to live in that kind of culture, that kind of society. But that's the direction we're going. Now, by the way, we all have friends who are not white. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the intentional, willful destruction of Western culture, Western civilization. And if you don't like it, you're a racist. But we're seeing it before our very eyes. Now, it depends on who you listen to. Young Earth creationists say we've been around for 6,000 years. Anthropologists say that we've been around for 200,000 years. That people have been living in Europe continuously for about 43,000 years. So if we go with that number from a secular perspective, white people, Western people, have been in Europe for 43,000 years. And archaeologists can go back and they can, they find carvings that date back to, I can't remember what they call that original era now, but they dig up carvings and they look at them and they say, those were white people. We have dominated, existed, well, almost exclusively, what is now Western Europe for 43,000 years, or 6,000 if you're a creationist. And in just the last 43 years, we've thrown it all away. And I say we, I didn't, because I wasn't given a choice in it. Well, back in 1965, we had an immigration policy in the United States that the number of immigrants by percentage had to reflect the existing population by number of percentage. So if there's 12% black population, then the immigration rate had to be 12% black or lower, couldn't exceed that. So that existed up till 1965, and then they did away with it. It was called the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1965, I think. I can't remember the official name of it off the top of my head. In 1965, I was 12 years old. And what I remember back in that time were Corvettes, and playing on the playground and going to school. I had no idea that the federal government had just given away my future and the future of my children and grandchildren and progeny for effectively forever. Nobody knew it, but let's put it in this context. Back in 1965, I would go to school, and without warning, we would have air raid drills because the Cuban Missile Crisis, you never know when the communists are going to drop an atomic bomb on you. So they would herd us all out into the hallway, and we'd have to get down on our hands and not our hands and knees, get down on our knees, put our hands in the back of our head, and protect ourselves in case our school was blown up. Which they probably ought to do that now that the Muslims are invading our country. But so we were protecting ourselves against a nuclear attack. What we didn't understand was the nuclear attack did strike, figuratively speaking. And that nuclear blast was the 1965 Immigration and Nationalization Act. That was the bomb. That was the nuclear bomb that destroyed the United States of America. But it was done subtly. We did not know it even occurred until we saw the fallout. Some 43 years later, we see what they're doing to us. And when they passed that legislation in the United States, they were passing similar legislation throughout all of Western Europe and Australia simultaneously. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think the cultural Marxists did that by design. I think it was intentional. If I keep talking, I'm going to lose my voice.
but you're fascinating, Ken. That is why I like having you on the show, because you give us such a broad perspective on anything. My passion makes my viewpoint very narrow. My passion for white South Africans, my passion for saving them, my passion, there's only so many hours in a day that you can study things, and I have to study those things. So it makes me kind of lose the bigger perspective, but you have a firm grasp on that. And it puts things worldwide into perspective for all of us. Because for me, I can compare what's happening in South Africa with what's happening in the USA and draw comparisons all day long. But the bigger perspective which you are giving us, I have to admit that if I did it between 3 and 6 in the morning instead of sleeping, I might have time and energy for it. But I do have to sleep sometimes. So I really love having your perspective, because you look at it so clearly and explain things so simply that anybody can understand. Because what is happening in South Africa now is accelerating at such a pace that one can't keep touch anymore. And it is really frightening how the hordes are overcoming the small number of people there. And I don't know that as you've just said, we didn't do it. We didn't see it coming. But to reverse it is almost impossible because of all those 8 things that you've just mentioned, the brainwashing techniques that have been used on us forever. So if I say there were 7 white people tortured and slaughtered by black savages this weekend, I immediately want to zip my lip and say, oh, I shouldn't have said that, because it makes me a bad person. But it is a fact. And I'm not trying to label all black people as savages or murderers, but the fact remains that anybody, white, black, yellow, pink, who can do that to fellow human beings is a savage. And yet, even I am so brainwashed into thinking, oops, I shouldn't say that because people are going to come down on my head. So telling the truth has become, you have to disavow the truth in case you are labeled. And that is just not good. It really is not good, because there are so few of us telling the truth and standing up against this brainwashing. Are silenced, then what happens?
Well, we are convinced that the truth is racist. Reality is racist, so we will steer clear of it. A lot of people saw the TV series, the, what do they call it, TV movie serial called Roots.
Yes.
Totally fictional. I call that the Roots narrative. There is so much they left out. I call that lying by omission.
Yeah.
They just don't tell the truth. And so they change our minds. They create a different perspective. By the way, on the screen, on my stream, I'm playing the video of Robert J. Lifton, if anybody, just so you can see what the guy looks like if you find it. But if you were to pick up your Bible and read the 10 Commandments and try to find that commandment, thou shalt not lie, guess what? It's not there. The commandment is, thou shalt not bear false witness.
Yeah.
There is a difference. Bearing false witness means giving a false impression.
Yeah.
So what the Roots narrative did is it gave us the false impression. We were under the impression that white people owned slaves, and that's the end of the story. They were mean to them, so forth, so on. They don't tell us about the thousands of free black people and slaves. They don't tell us about the phenomenally successful black millionaires, adjusted for inflation, that lived during the antebellum South. They don't tell us about the orphanage, not the orphanage, but the school that was built in New Orleans, trying to think of the name of it, in, I think it was in the 1840s. It was funded by a wealthy black couple, and the school was for black orphans. That wasn't in Roots. Hang on a second. They've been telling me all these years that little black children were denied education throughout the slavery era. Fact of the matter is, that's just not true. It just is simply not true. Now, the truth is that the very few people were educated in the 19th century. The literacy rate was horrific compared to today. There was not a black issue. Now, granted, white people had greater access to education than access to education than did blacks. We understand that, but they go to the extreme. That's what Robert Lifton was explaining. You got to go to the absolute extreme. So they're lying by omission, because they're not telling us that there were, in fact, a lot of black people who were educated. There were black people who went to college. How'd that happen? I thought they couldn't read.
Yeah.
It just simply isn't true.
But that if you bring that back to South Africa, that's exactly what is told about South Africa, that we did not educate the black children. We denied them education. We put them on the worst subsistence farming places where they couldn't feed themselves, etc. Well, then I ask you, how did Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela become lawyers, went through school and university in apartheid South Africa? How is that possible if we refuse these people in education and starve them by their millions? I mean, as you say, the lies by omission. Why is it that the black population under the apartheid rule grew by 920%? If we were so wicked and murdering them and killing them off and starving them and slaughtering their babies and all of those bad things that we are convicted of today, why then did that population grow by such an enormous number? It's throughout the world, Ken, but it is sad that this South African white population are being slaughtered, tortured, murdered because of those things that you have just mentioned, because the world is now so convinced that every white South African is a racist, black oppressor, neo-Nazi who wants to return to the apartheid era, that they can't see us as anything else. And so you've seen the comments on videos. It's karma. We deserve it because we did this to the blacks. But if you look at the real history of it, there were about 7,000 blacks murdered during the apartheid years. And of that number, the majority were between the two opposing black parties, the ANC and Inkatha Freedom Party. The biggest number of murders came from them, not from white people. And yet since apartheid ended, there have been 400,000 murders in South Africa, both black and white. But nobody wants to talk about that because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Yeah, and we were under the impression that Black Lives Matter, but that's one of the points that Dr. Lifton pointed out. There are these absolutes, and you got to stick to the absolutes. So yeah. Black Lives Matter under a given scenario, a narrative, within the confines of their little box. Black Lives Matter in there, but okay, take one of those black South Africans who was murdered by another black South African. That person's life, that black person's life does not matter.
No.
However, had that exact same person been in Chicago and assaulted a police officer and been shot dead, then that black person's life would have mattered. Now, I have on the screen, people on my stream can see it, a photograph of, I'm guessing maybe 300 or 400 elementary age students. This photograph was taken back in the 1800s. It's kind of obvious from the photograph. Photography wasn't very well developed back then. But what is interesting about this photograph, and you look at all these little kids, school children, sitting in neat rows, neatly dressed in their uniforms before some kind of a school structure. The thing you immediately notice about these kids is they're all Indians. We're told that white people came in and massacred all the Indians. Well, why do we still have Indians? But this tells a different story. White people are educating little Indian children. So we've been told a narrative. We've been told a paradigm. We've entered into a paradigm of delusion.
Yeah.
And do not get outside the flock. You know, yeah, have you ever seen a photograph, or if you grew up on a farm, you have seen it firsthand. You've got these sheep. And around the sheep are the sheepdogs. What do you call them? Sheepdogs, I guess. German shepherds. There you go. And they're keeping the sheep in line. And if one sheep dares to get away from the flock, the dog chases them back in. So we have to believe the delusion, the paradigm, the narrative, the cultural Marxism feeds us. And if we dare stray away, you've got this German shepherd that chases us back into the flock by accusing us of racism or extremism or white supremacy or all those other hate terms and pejoratives they use to attack us.
And then I wanted to draw the comparisons between the statues falling in South Africa and 2 years later, here we're doing the same thing in the United States. That for me is just horrific. And the blindness of people, the refusal to look at South Africa as the blueprint for what is coming to your country. I can tear my hair out in frustration because they're in very slow time. You can see the comparisons. It started with Rhodes must fall, then Kruger must fall, then everything that leads back to Jan van Riebeeck must fall. Then, you know, and then they were burning pictures, priceless, beautiful artworks. They were pulling out of the universities and burning them, and burning books and burning everything. And so here it is 2 years later in the United States. Now, if we learned from what was going on around us, and if we looked at what was going on around us, could we not have foreseen this and stopped it happening?
Could we? Well, I think we could have very well, but that's one of the reasons they didn't tell us. So, Mel, did you want to say anything? You've been kind of quiet again.
Mel's always very quiet in the background there. Always.
I'm learning. I'm always learning. Yeah, it's interesting because we are seeing a very similar thing that's happening in South Africa playing out across the world. And I've been saying this for a very long time. I've been writing about this for almost 10 years now. And, you know, people kind of have the impression that South Africa is this little country that's stuck sort of there. And, you know, what happens there doesn't affect the rest of the world. And South Africans within South Africa have that impression, like, you know, it's too bad here. And it's not like this anywhere else. But they don't realize that actually, you know, what they have there is just what is about to happen everywhere else. So this is the message to people in South Africa, is that, you know, you're not alone in this. This is actually happening in other parts of the world. You're not just stuck down at the bottom of Africa. And in fact, this is the reason why South Africa has always been used as a political testing ground, is because it was so far away from the rest of the world, so that they could get away with doing absolutely anything and pretty much spin it however they wanted in the mainstream media and the international press. And, you know, one of the best examples, of course, of this is the whole, and we've done this many times, Karin, but the two things that when you're a non-South African, you think of, you know, if you're not very educated, is, you know, maybe the name Nelson Mandela, and you know apartheid. Both those things are so grossly misrepresented in the international media. Both Nelson Mandela and the whole apartheid hype and spin and era has been totally misconstrued to the point where it's made to be a blight on the consciousness of white South Africa. And, you know, when I try to explain this to people, I get a lot of black people coming and pointing fingers at me and going, oh, you're just an apartheid apologist. I'm going, what am I apologizing for? I didn't do anything wrong. I came from a generation that wanted unity, that, you know, believed in the Rainbow Nation, and is just as disappointed. And in fact, I've had to, you know, become a refugee from my own country as a result of what's going on there. So why must I apologize for, you know, what people I had no contact with, no control over, what they did and what the policies they made? I'm one of the victims here. You know, I can go on to explain. I had a grandfather who actually was working in the capitalist mines, and he was killed in one of the biggest mining disasters in 1960, the Colesberg mining disaster. It's one of the biggest mining disasters in history. So, you know, we've suffered, even as white people, we've suffered at the hands of the globalist capitalist agenda, which has, you know, milked South Africa of its resources to fund the entire thing that's been going on. I mean, a good example of this is how Cecil John Rhodes actually set up in his wills amounts of money that went towards funding the roundtable groups who now know as the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group. Huge amounts of funding came from Rhodes's estate into getting that all going. And it actually says in his first will that he wants all of his estate to go towards the creation of what eventually will be the New World Order, which was at that time riding under the banner of British imperialism. Now it's, you know, Americanism, or whatever you want to call it, capitalism. But at that time, that's what it was. And again, where the roots of that is another whole long story, and where it all goes back to and who's ultimately controlling everything is another matter up for debate. But what we can't ignore the fact that South Africa is very much central and pivotal to the whole global conspiracy and the whole agenda that's playing out, where we're going to end up having huge amounts of the human population genocided, as you mentioned, as per the Georgia Guidestones. So one of the reasons why Karin and I do the show is obviously to try and raise awareness about what's happening in South Africa, put a magnifying glass onto the dire state of affairs that's going on, also to give a platform to those people who are able to speak out and who have been smart enough to do the research and find things out for themselves, and those people who are actively making a difference on the ground, taking people in and helping people. Karin's doing very much the same, helping people immigrate to the States, those that can get out. But there are many, many more who are stuck in dire poverty without the aid of the state. And this is basically what we're going to see sort of unfolding in America, is these FEMA camps that have been set up all over the show are going to be put into action, and they're going to be very much used in the same way the white squatter camps are in South Africa at the moment. You're going to have the same thing happening there, and we just need one disaster. And I'm thinking, you know, it could be anything like bringing out a new virus or a biological warfare. I always joke with people, yeah, zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, but
it's gonna happen. It's gonna reach a point where there's an acceleration, a crescendo of events, which pushes everything right over the edge into the exact square agenda that the globalists have lined up and intend to unfold upon us. And South Africa, unfortunately, has been the resources that have facilitated this. They've had the various influentials who have somehow managed to control Africa from outside its borders for all these years, whilst playing out this illusion of various forms of independence, currency change, freedom, rainbow nations, end of apartheid, which was, you know, meant absolutely nothing in the grander scheme of things. It was just all public relations exercises to manage the perception of the public and brainwash us into believing in false facts. When in fact, what was always happening behind the scenes was South Africa was a testing ground and is a testing ground, and they were testing out the accelerated version of what we now see going on in the United States and across other parts of the world. And we're going to see this dichotomy playing out. It's always something. It's the black, it's the white, it's the Muslims, it's the Christians. You're going to now have the East and the West. You've had Russia, America. there's always going to be some kind of polarization playing off against each other. They use these artificial mechanisms of division to get us kind of blaming each other instead of looking at where the real problem comes from and where the origins of all of the suppression is. Feel free to jump in, Ken.
I'm sorry?
So feel free to jump in.
Oh, okay. I was waiting for more. I thought you were taking a dramatic pause there. So my apologies. Well, just for the sake of illustration, let me just make up a story. And this is not totally fiction, but it's largely fiction. Then you got to pay close attention because it's only going to take about 2 minutes. But after I tell the story, then I'm going to tell the true story. But the story is this. It's fictional, but the story is this, that back in the 19th century, there was an African family. You had a husband and wife and 7 kids. And they decided they were going to relocate to another part of Africa. So the husband and wife gathered up their children and they started on the journey. But the friends warned them. They said, don't go to that other town because it is too dangerous to make the trip, because in between here and there are these horrific slave traders, and they are like savages. They will kill you if necessary, but they will kidnap you. They will sell you into slavery, and life for you will be horrible. Well, they didn't really believe it, and so mom and dad gathered their little 7 black children together, and they made the trip. Well, sure enough, along the journey, they were attacked by slave traders, and they killed the entire family except for 2 little girls. One of them was 14, and one of them, I think, was considerably younger, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7. And they took them into slavery. The older girl, they actually tattooed her. I mean, this is horrible. And the little girl, they didn't care about her, so they let her starve to death. Okay, now do you want to hear the real story? Okay, the real story takes us back to 1850, and it's not in the United States. It's not in Africa. It's in the United States. And the family is not black. The family is white. This is Roy's, R-O-Y-S, and Mary Oatman. They had 7 children, ages 17 to 1 year old. And they decided that they would relocate. These people, by the way, were Mormons, and this is back again in 1850. So as they were making their trek to their new location, they were attacked by Indians. First of all, the Indians approached them and asked for tobacco and food. And once they won their confidence and they let down their guard, they were attacked. The story says this: at some point during the encounter, the Oatman family was attacked by the group, and all were killed except for Lorenzo, age 15, who is brutally clubbed and left for dead. That is a teenage boy. Olive, age 14, and Mary Ann, age 7, were taken to be slaves. So they thought the 15-year-old boy had died. He actually survived and was able to tell the story later. So they took these 2 little girls into slavery. The older girl was made to work. She was tattooed. The little girl was totally worthless. I don't know if they raped these girls or not. The story doesn't tell us. But they just wouldn't feed her. They left her to die. Well, eventually, the older girl was able to escape after several years, but in the interim, they were sold to a different tribe. And so this is a case that was repeated over and over again throughout American history. When white settlers were attacked by savage Indians, and this began back in the colonial era, by the way, it wasn't just in the mid-1800s. They were brutally murdered. Their children were taken into captivity as slaves. And so, yes, there is a legacy in the United States that is horrific about slavery. But it wasn't black slavery. It was white slavery. And when this girl was finally able to escape, they were amazed. And by the way, I'm going to scroll up here. I've got the story on the screen here.
Yeah.
The folks who are watching the stream can actually see a photograph that was taken of Olive Oatman. And you can see on her face that she has been tattooed from her, her chin was tattooed to look like the Indians. And then, after she escaped, she was able to acclimate back to Western society. And the story says that she died in 1903 at age 65. Now, what I'm wondering as I tell this story, the first story I told was fiction, but that's the one we believe. The second story I told was reality, and it's been replayed over and over and over again. And we have been lied to by a mission. Nobody will tell the stories about the colonists and the pioneers who were massacred by savage Indians. In fact, you can't even talk about it. They call you racist. But it happened. This family was buried in a mass grave because the terrain was so difficult they couldn't dig graves. They're still there. You can go out and look at the grave if you want to. It's still there. And this happened over and over and over again. Why is this not incorporated in our government schools as they teach kids about history? Why don't they talk about white people who were brutally massacred, as they are being now in South Africa, and taken into slavery? Why don't they tell about this? And we have seen this over and over and over again. There's a book, I read a book about this a couple of years ago. Wish I could remember the name of it. See what happens when you get old, your mind starts to forget things. Okay, so this is reality. This is real history. How are we going to react to this? Well, the way that we react to it, or reacted to it, is we go back to that image that I had on the screen before. What did white people do after they were enslaved and massacred? They opened schools for Indian children. That's how they respond. They responded and reacted with kindness, as I think they should have, but not to the point where we allow ourselves to be destroyed. I'm wondering, considering that so many white people were massacred and taken into slavery, kind of like Roots, only it was white people being taken into slavery by Indians. Well, why don't we go around and take down all the monuments to Indians? Why don't we decide that every city and town and street, every named place in the country that is named after Indians should be renamed? I mean, they renamed Mount McKinley, right, to accommodate the Indians. Well, why don't we do that backwards? Why? Because Indians were brutal. Not all of them, but they were brutal, just like some of the Confederates were brutal. Not all of them. Some of the slave owners were brutal. Not all of them. But most of them, it's kind of like adopting children. Sometimes adopting parents can be very mean to their kids. Most of them aren't. Same thing was true during slavery. But why aren't we taking down the name places of Indians? That would be a lot of name places because why would we do that? Well, because slavery is evil. And white people were subjected to slavery. So we're going to take a stand against this evil, and we're going to remove anything and everything that has an Indian name to it. That would be a lot of renaming. Well, we all know nobody's going to do that, but we're going to focus exclusively on white people who had slaves, who treated them extremely, extremely well. And once again, if we really cared about slavery, if we really cared about the abuse of humans, we would not be taking down monuments. We'd be taking down mosques. We would be kicking out the Muslims. These people are disingenuous. They don't care about slavery. They don't care about the history of America. What they care about is destroying Western culture, and they use that little component as a pretext to do it, ignoring 99.9% of reality as if it were not there. Okay, did you want to interject something before I go on?
Well, Ken, you talk about taking down all the monuments, renaming everything. They've done that in South Africa. Now, if I were to go back today, I'd never be able to find my way around because every town has been renamed. And because I've spent 50 years knowing a thing as warm baths or something like that. Pretoria is now Shwani, and Transvaal is now Gauteng, and I would never be able to find my way anywhere in South Africa today because every street name, every city, everything has been changed. And now they're going to change the name of South Africa some as well. Azania is maybe going to be its new name. They haven't made up their minds about it. So they do go to those extreme lengths. And what is disturbing about that is the cost of it. It is not renaming a street. It is changing it on all the maps, changing it in everybody's stationery. The cost of it is enormous. While today, the latest figures on unemployment, etc., came out, 57% of youth under 20 years old under 30 years old are unemployed. So could they not take that money that they are throwing down an endless pit and use it to uplift the people instead, their own people? The government is black. They should be using money to uplift their people. They've got all these rules in place, 119 race-based laws, supposedly to help their people. And yet, 50% of them are unemployed. The country is at junk status. They need to be at 6.9% GDP for the next 10 years in order to uplift these people. It's not going to happen. So as you say, they don't care about the people. They really don't care. It's all in what they can get the people to believe about them and feel that they're doing well. It's scary, Ken. It really is scary.
Well, let's take this example. Mel, did you want to interject something before we go on?
No, carry on, Ken.
Okay, well, let's imagine, I like to use this analogy because I think it fits so very well. But let's imagine the day that you were born. To me, that was back in 1953. That's a long time ago. But imagine the day I was born. There was somebody standing there with a video camera. Okay, I know there were no video cameras in 1953, but this is just an illustration. Somebody was standing there with a video camera and recorded my birth or your birth. And they recorded the entire day. The whole day recorded me the whole time. And then when they wrapped me in a little bundle or wrapped you in a little bundle and took you home from the hospital, they recorded that too. I mean, they got in the car with your parents or whoever, and the camera was never turned off. Your first day, your first week, your first year, your entire life, everything you did until you died at age 100, everything you did was recorded. Now they're going to take this 100-year-long recording and they're going to play it at your funeral. Well, the problem is that the funeral's going to last 100 years. You can't do that. So what they're going to do is they're going to go edit this video down to 5 minutes. So they're going to play the 5-minute recap of your life at your funeral. Well, the guy who's doing the editing doesn't like you. And so as he reviews through portions of this video, he finds the worst things you ever said, the worst things you ever did, you know, when you swore, when you used profanity, maybe you stole something, maybe you cheated in school. Those tiny little snippets, they're going to take, the producer's going to take out of that video and compress it into 5 minutes. And that's what they're going to show at your funeral. 5 minutes of you lying, stealing, cheating, you know, having temper tantrums. And when people watch that video at your funeral, they're going to say, this was a horrible person. That's what they have done to American history. They have edited out nearly all of the good things that we have done and accomplished. And they leave in only the worst of the worst. And then they lie about it. They make it worse than it actually was. But that is what our kids are being taught American history. Now, you asked earlier, Karin, what is life going to be like when white people are gone? Well, just imagine how they're going to teach history 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Yeah. White people didn't invent the light bulb. Some black guy did that, and white people took credit for it. The Wright brothers did not invent the airplane. Actually, some black people did, and the white people took advantage of it. And that's the way they will rewrite history. So 100 years from today, after white people are gone, the perception of us will be that we were like demons. We were horrible people because they took our history and they edited it down to 5 minutes with only the worst of the worst. And then they lied about that. They made it even worse than it actually was. That's what our children and our children's children have to look forward to. And it's not going to be a very pleasant thing unless we do something about it. And by the way, that's why the cultural Marxist and the economic Marxist absolutely positively despise the internet. What they don't want us doing is what we are doing at this very moment. They can't stand it because we're telling the truth. They don't like the fact that I'm showing photographs of hundreds of little Indian children being educated by white people. Karin, they don't want you going on the internet telling the entire world that white people are being massacred in South Africa, and it's epidemic. What they really don't want us to do is talk about black on white crime in the United States. If you do that, you're a racist. But even though it's reality, they absolutely positively despise the internet because we now have a forum by which we can bypass the mainstream, what I call the mainstream Marxist media, or the national media. We get the truth out there. And we're actually, when people see the truth, what are they going to do with it? Now, we talked earlier about brainwashing. If you ever encounter somebody, there was a guy, his name slips my mind. There goes that other ace thing again. But his life is dedicated to deprogramming people who are caught up in dangerous religious cults. And I've kind of followed his work over the years. How do you deprogram somebody? Well, apply his principles to cultural Marxism. And it's really kind of simple what he does. He will take somebody who's been caught up in one of these stupid, silly cults that are sometimes dangerous, and he will confront them with the truth. Just that simple. And so what happens is that person's mind, in their mind, they are forced to compare their belief system with reality, and they are forced to see the disparity. And their initial reaction is to reject reality for what Dr. Lifton called sacred science. But you keep exposing those people to reality, and after a while, they come to realize, wait a minute, what I believe doesn't jive with the facts. And we have seen this time and time again, where people have come out of the so-called Antifa movement, which is really the anti-First Amendment movement. We have seen those people, after they have been confronted with reality, say, wait a minute, why am I believing this nonsense? So it works. That's why they hate the internet. Because what we are doing is we are deprogramming, the way I like to phrase it, is people whose minds have been infected with a cultural Marxism virus. What we do is we are providing the truth, which is the antidote that kills the virus. To say, hey, here's what's happening. These are white people who are being massacred in South Africa. Okay, here's a dose of the antivirus. Go on the internet, Google the search term South Africa farm murders, then click on images. Just that simple. Welcome to the truth. That will deprogram you. Now, what if you don't want to be deprogrammed and you don't want anyone else to be deprogrammed? Well, you got to shut us up. You got to make Karen Smith be quiet. You got to get me off the internet. And believe me, they are trying desperately to do that. And eventually, I think they're probably, I hate to say it, but probably they're going to succeed. Because just as they saw Daily Stormer as this evil racist, and we say, well, so what? Well, they see all patriots as evil racists. They don't distinguish between us and Andrew Anglin. I think that was his name. To them, we're all just a bunch of Nazis. You know, again, they dress us up in Klan uniforms, psychologically, mentally. They dress us up in Nazi uniforms, and that's the way they see us. To them, from their perspective, their demented perspective, after they've been brainwashed, they see all white people as innately born and bred racist. Well, we've got to get inside their heads with the truth and deprogram them. So, the bad guys don't want us to do that, and the only way they can stop us is to shut us up. One of the core fundamentals of Western civilization is the principle of free speech for that very reason. Number one, it allows unpopular opinions to be expressed, even if they're wrong, but it gives us the opportunity to compare, to put everything on the table at once and compare it. And when you do that, you can see when you compare the real dollar with a fake dollar, that's when you see the counterfeit, but not until. I don't know if you've ever been paid in counterfeit dollars. I have. I couldn't tell the difference until I got to the bank. The expression on the teller's face was absolutely hilarious. Fortunately, I'd been a customer at that bank for years, so they knew me. She showed up to make a deposit with counterfeit dollars, and she knew immediately they were counterfeit. I didn't know. Why? Because over the years, she'd been looking at the reality, real dollars. So the myths, what you call the narrative, Karin, the paradigm that the cultural Marxists have been presenting is counterfeit. It's counterfeit history. It's fake news. Fake news is nothing more than fake history in real time. And if you don't know what is real, you're going to believe that. So they got to shut us up because we're saying, wait a minute, this history is counterfeit. This news is fake. These are not real dollars. They can't have us doing that because they're liars. They live in this false world. And sometimes I just wonder, do they know that? I'm sure there are cultural Marxists out there who are preaching this horrific dogma of Marxism who actually think they're right. But I think there are many others who have to know that what they're teaching is wrong, except for the outcome. They think it's okay to lie and deceive and destroy because in the end, we're all going to be equal. There's going to be 500 million of us. We're going to live in perfect harmony with nature, and the evils of free market enterprise will be gone. That, to the end of it, they believe in. But they've got to know that we're not racist, some of them. They've got to know that. They know they're lying. They've got to know that their distortion of history is, in fact, a distortion of history. They got to know that. They justify it because the end justifies the means. That's my opinion.
Well, Ken, the politicians in both countries, both Congress here and Parliament in South Africa, they of everybody must know that they are lying through their teeth because their story changes depending on what is the best way for the wind to be blowing today. And the Zoomers in South Africa had to hire a British PR firm to bolster the looks of what they were doing, robbing South Africa blind. Well, they were caught in the act, and it's become an international incident right now. But surely both sides of this pond between South Africa and the USA, surely both groups of people in charge or supposedly in charge of the countries know that what they are giving us is total nonsense. They of everybody must know it because, as you know, their story changes. Nancy Pelosi, for instance, has walked through those halls in Congress since 1979 and never wanted those statues to come down. Never until this week. So they know they're lying. They know they're selling a brand of nonsense. And the country just falls in line behind them. It's ridiculous.
So we have to conclude that up until this week, Nancy Pelosi was a racist.
Yes.
Of course, they never think of that, but she was complicit to racism by not condemning the Confederate statues.
Yes.
Or the statues of Washington and Jefferson, for that matter.
Exactly. And all the rest of them have walked through those halls every single day that they managed to be at work, which is not many days of the year, but those days that they were in D.C. They have walked through that hall blindly, didn't realize, didn't know. What is their excuse today for suddenly becoming aware of this? It's craziness. It is craziness. And I can't, as a human being, find it very difficult to wrap my head around all of this, because they are blatantly lying. And do they really take the population for such idiots? Do they think that we don't see it?
Well, unfortunately, many do not see it. But having heard you say that, I can't help but to wonder what's next. What today is okay, but tomorrow it's going to be racism, or it's going to be sexism, or it's going to be something else.
Yes.
If you listen to the science guy,
Bill Nye.
I call him Bill Deny, the science guy.
Yeah.
He did a video a few years ago where he was explaining the difference between the XY and the XX chromosome. That was solid science. Well, now they have what Dr. Lifton calls, what does he call it again? I think mystical science.
Yeah.
Well, now those chromosomes don't make any difference. Well, I'm wondering...
To the same guy, he's out there today saying that it's a social construct, being male or female. The same man, Ken.
Same man, yeah. Sacred science is what the term I was thinking of. So that is their sacred science. Their science is there is no distinction, that it's all a social construct. But 10 years ago, they were saying just the opposite. And the same thing with global warming. It's not global warming, it's now climate change.
Yeah.
How do they not know that they're being hypocritical? Well, I guess in their minds they must justify it or they wouldn't do it.
Well, Ken, surely from a personal point of view, all you have to do is look out your window at 3 different hours of the day and you will know there's climate change. Surely. I mean, this we don't need millions and millions and billions and gazillions of dollars all around the world to convince us of this. You just need to look out the window and the climate changes. So they take the population for absolute fools. I mean, that guy, the architect of Obamacare, he straight out said that the people are so damn stupid they'll never catch on to this. So that is what they believe. And they refuse to see that we're not. By the way, that's a 5-minute warning.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about language loading terms that are used to brainwash us. And one of those terms is climate change denier.
Yeah, yes.
I've never met a climate change denier. Like you were talking before, like you said before. All you got to do is look out your window. We know climate is changing. There's no such thing as a climate change denier.
No.
But that's what they call us. It's a language loading term that they interject into our lexicon. So if you don't agree with them, it's like you're denying the law of gravity. In fact, I've heard people say that. To deny climate change as they present it is no different from denying the law of gravity. Totally absurd, but we are convinced that there is no difference between genders. There's no difference between races. We buy all these myths. These are sacred sciences that do not exist. But you better not deny the fact that cow is your relative, because if you do, you will be ostracized. You will be stigmatized. Nobody will talk to you. You will be shunned, to use a religious term. And so what are you going to do? Well, you're going to pretend the cow is your relative. Otherwise, you can't get a job. So you have to go along to get along, as they say. And it's absolutely positively horrific what they are doing to us, and just dare disagree with them. Try to establish what is reality and live in a real world. And see how terrible it is to get outside that flock. I mean, you got the German Shepherds coming after you. They want to corral you back in.
They're not corralling you. They are nipping at your backside. Ken, really. I mean, they're not going to do it gently. they long past that stage of just you're blowing the whistle and the dog chases you in. No, 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 no. You know, they're not going to do that anymore. It's becoming vicious, because it's not now enough to just name you. Look what they're doing to those people from Charlottesville. They're outing them on the internet. They've lost their jobs. They've lost their place in university. And they were not necessarily neo-Nazis or any of the other things that those people are being called. They were simply there. And that
well, at least one of them was black.
Yes, yes.
What do they do with that guy?
Well, he's also a neo-Nazi, because you understand that by some scientific miracle, that's how it works today. So it is now becoming a thing that affects your entire life and your family and everything else. And so it's vicious. It is vicious now. And it takes courage to step outside that little huddle of sheep.
And like you say, it is extremely dangerous. I'm thinking of the guy, you probably saw this in the news, who worked for, I think it was Google. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
He was yeah, and he published something that had to do with discrimination against men. Mm. And he was just establishing some basic facts that men tend to be better at math than women. And he was condemned as a sexist because he strayed away from the sheepfold, strayed away from the fold, and so they fired him. Okay, well, what if he happened to be wrong? Do you fire somebody for being wrong? That's not why you fire people. I mean, if he's incompetent at his job and he's not doing what he's paid to do, then I can understand why you would fire him. But they do just the opposite. They will hire totally incompetent people based solely on the color of their skin to fill a job opening. And they get paid money they don't deserve. I recall when I was in the hospital a few years ago for heart surgery. To make a long story very short, I was out in the state park hiking and my heart stopped. Fortunately, somebody found me and I woke up being chucked in the back of an ambulance. And they took me to the hospital, installed a heart valve. But I remember there was a guy on the maintenance crew, a white guy, and I never saw anybody work so hard in my life. But there was another guy, a black guy, who did the same job, and he would stand in the hallway and talk on his cell phone extremely loudly for like an hour at a time, you know, to the point where I had to call, you know, the nurse and say, will you tell that guy to shut up? He should not have a job. But if the white guy had published something on the internet saying that, you know, I think men are better at math than women, that guy, he would have been the one that got fired. It doesn't make sense. But that's the world in which we live. It all focuses on political correctness. You got to stay in the sheepfold. And if you get, you know, that's the only thing that matters, is you have to go along. And you stop and think, Karin and Mel, about people in Hollywood who are not necessarily conservatives. I'm thinking of, what's her name, Roseanne Barr. I don't think she's a conservative, but she's not necessarily going along with the liberals. And they attack her. Why? Because it's akin to marching in a parade. And you got to go along with the band. And if you decide to get away from the band, you're totally kicked out. It's not that you're going in the opposite direction, but you got to march lockstep. And in Hollywood, you have to walk lockstep. Here's a trivia question. See if you guys know the answer to this. What is the whitest city in California? Any idea? The answer is Malibu. It's where all the rich white liberals live. These people who are adamantly opposed to forced segregation are segregated. Whitest city in California is Malibu. I think Palisades is like the third whitest. Bunch of liberals up there. The whitest state in the United States is West Virginia. Second whitest state is what state is Bernie Sanders from?
Oh, I can't recall right now.
hang on a second. Whatever it is, that is the second whitest state. I was thinking Delaware, but I'm not sure.
Sorry, folks. On that note, I just have to pop in and say we've come to the end of our show. So I just want to say thank you very much, Ken, for joining us and for sharing your insight. It's been really educational. And I just wanted to get details from you of where people can find your work.
Sure. First of all, he's from Vermont. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. But Vermont is the second whitest state in the union. Okay, you want my contact information? The best way to reach me is to go to my website, which is dailyken.com. Spell it with 2 N's, dailyken.com. And there's kind of a hub from there. You can find me on Facebook and on YouTube. And most of my emphasis is on YouTube.
Thank you so very, very much, Ken, for jumping in and taking the spot today and for educating us. You have such a unique perspective on things. I could listen to you all day.
Unfortunately, I can't talk all day. I'm even losing my voice now. So.
But thank you very, very much, Ken.
Okay, you are welcome. I appreciate you having me.
All right, brilliant, folks. Thanks for everyone who's tuned in, and we will see you all again on Stop South African Genocide. It's been great being with you. From me, Mel V. Take care. We'll be with you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.